Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third week of Great Decisions. We have an excellent lecture coming up for you this evening from Dr. Alise Coen. But before we get started, I wanted to thank our sponsors, because without our series sponsors, we would not be able to present this fantastic program to you. So once again, our thanks to the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and Lakeshore Pax Christi. So a huge amount of thanks to all of those groups that lend their support to the library and to Great Decisions. It's tremendous. One other brief announcement before I turn things over to Dr. Coen. I just wanted to remind you that we are doing this live. So if you have any questions or comments that you would like to have Professor Coen answer at the end of the presentation, just type them into your comment section. Same way really as you would do it if you were live in the room. Just type them in and I will get them out to Dr. Coen as quickly as possible. So without further ado, allow me to introduce you to Dr. Coen. Dr. Alise Coen is Associate Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Public and Environmental Affairs Unit at UW Green Bay. She earned her PhD in Political Science from the University of Delaware and her BA in International Relations from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Her research focuses on global governance, refugees, human rights, and U.S. foreign policy, and has been published in journals such as Ethics and International Affairs, Politics and Religion, International Relations, and the International Journal of Human Rights. So I will turn the evening over to Dr. Coen and allow me to bring up her PowerPoint presentation and we'll get started. So Dr. Coen, the mic is yours and I will be taking myself out of the picture in just a second.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you everyone for tuning in to the stream. And I'm excited to speak with you about the topic that we have on changing demographics. As usual, I added my own subtitle to give it a little bit of my personal touch of what I'll be focusing on tonight. So we can see for our opening here that along with changing demographics, I'm going to be highlighting aspects of migration, sustainability, and a Pandemic Planet. So, as Tim said, I'm Dr. Coen, and I think we can go ahead and flip to the first slide here. I have a lot of visuals tonight, so that's what I'm going to try and do to help keep your attention with all of the statistics and figures and data that we have with this topic. It can be sometimes kind of hard to follow, so I'll try and take it slowly. Just starting out here to begin, I wanted to define what we mean by demographic changes. So demographic changes refer to changes in the characteristics of human populations and groups. Some examples include population growth and movements, changes in mortality and life expectancy, changes in fertility and age structure. And if we look at population changes, which are captured by this graph from the United Nations on the left, one of the major demographic trends of the past century has been the rapid growth in our human population. So we can see in this graph, we now have over 7 billion people inhabiting the planet. And this is due in part to major advancements that we've had in science and technology and public policies, which have helped drive down mortality rates. So if you think about infant mortality, child mortality, maternal mortality, for example, those have all fallen in the past decades to improve our overall life expectancy. The world population average life expectancy is projected to reach 77 by the year 2050, and by the end of the century might be as high as 82. So that's far longer than humans have lived in past centuries. This life expectancy is just an average, so it's important to keep in mind that for those 7 billion people, there are demographic variations by location and region. In countries like Italy and Japan, for example, the life expectancy can be as high as 88. And living conditions in countries like Somalia or South Sudan are much harsher, so people in those countries may only live around 60 years or less. So one theme that we're going to see in a lot of these slides is that there's a great inequity in these demographic factors, like life expectancy. We can also see that inequity reflected with the impact of COVID-19. So in the US, Black, Native American, Latinx, and Hispanic people have made up 60% of the deaths, despite making up only about a third of our population. So those disparities in social determinants of health will also impact demographic factors around life expectancy. By the way, by social determinants of health, I mean things like access to education, healthcare quality, economic stability, even the kind of access to institutions and neighborhoods where people live. And life expectancy has declined on average a little over 1 year for American men and women due to the pandemic. But among Black men in America, that life expectancy decline was actually 3 times higher. So that's some example that we can see for these inequities related to things like life expectancy in our global population. If you look at the top right of this slide, you'll also see another global demographic trend, and that's this notion that we're getting much older. And we have experienced what's called quote unquote aging populations as part of our declining fertility rates on the planet. So these two factors are interrelated, of course. Women and families, especially in wealthier developed countries, have had less children. So the median age of populations has actually increased. If we think about the 1960s, the average age of the world population was just around 24 years old. So it was a relatively young global population. And much of human history was similar. Today, the average age worldwide is around 30 years old. And the elderly proportion of our population, meaning people over 80, has actually tripled in the last 60 years. So in many countries, a quarter of the population is projected to be over 65 by the end of the century. Continuing low birth rates combined with improved longevity, meaning that we're living longer, means the ratio of working age people will likely continue to decline. So this is actually a major achievement in health and quality of life globally that we have this issue, but it also raises challenges around how can governments budget and tax and provide social and health services in a way that's sustainable especially in terms of assisting with the caretaking costs of elderly populations. So when you hear these growing concerns about aging populations or demographic decline, those are focused on the economic, social structure consequences of the fact that as a global population, we've been getting older. Next, if you look on the right here, you'll see we have this trend that the United Nations has highlighted of people on the move. And so this is really getting to the idea of international migrants growing around the world. People are crossing borders, traveling to and residing in countries that they were not born in, either to work or to study or to find safety and to live. So it's important to keep in mind, first of all, that humans have always migrated and moved as part of our evolution as a species. For long periods of human history, certain tribes and groups were nomadic, and moving was just a natural feature of our existence. It was not until the late 1600s that we saw the emergence of our current nation state system, where we have these centralized governments with permanent national militaries and countries marked by land borders. As my students in global politics know well, a lot of these changes were solidified after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. But after World War II, especially, we saw that international migration steadily rose from just about 2% of the world population to almost 3% of the world population. Now, the sheer numbers of international migrants seem really striking, going up to, 173 million in 2000. Those numbers seem really large. But we should just keep in mind that as a percentage of the overall population, it hasn't been that much of a growth. It's also related to the fact that we have this growing raw population, right? As we saw on the first graphic, roughly 7 billion people now. So I just like to remind people of that perspective and not exaggerate too much the share of the global population that is migrating. Another trend that we see there is that we're becoming more urbanized. And with this, we can go to the next slide. So urbanization is something that refers to a rising amount of people concentrated in relatively small areas, as opposed to people living in more rural, spread out areas in the past. This graphic that you see is from the Migration Data Portal, which is supported by the International Organization of Migration. And it's showing you the share in the percent of the world's population living in urban areas to try and capture how that has grown recently. So again, we're thinking about really high population density, which is usually accompanied by a high density of infrastructure. You can think of buildings, roads, homes, bridges, railways, commercial offices. So urban areas have all of this economic and human activity. And in more urban areas, people then tend to live and work very closely together. In the US, we define an urban area as having over 2,500 inhabitants in a settlement. And as this graphic is showing you, just about 30% of the people in the world used to live like that in those urbanized areas back in the 1950s. But today, it's over half of the world's population, which is urbanized. By the end of the decade, it's projected that roughly 60% of the world will be urbanized. To give you some regional context for these numbers, by the way, North America is one of the most urbanized regions in the world. So we have about 80% of the population in North America already living in urban areas. And this is related to something that you'll notice on the bottom of the slide here, the rise of global cities. These are also called world cities or mega cities. And they are cities usually with over 10 million inhabitants. So in 1950, only New York City and Tokyo were considered megacities, but today we have over 30 megacities in the world. A lot of them are in less developed regions. So you can think of Delhi in India, or Shanghai and Beijing in China, Sao Paulo in Brazil, Mexico City, Cairo. These are some examples. Of course, most people will think automatically of New York City in the US and London. And the graphic at the bottom of the slide is just showing us this connection that these global cities or megacities are home to roughly 1/5 of the world's foreign-born population. So we're getting from this that urbanization trends are interconnected with global migration trends. And with that, we can go to the next slide. So let's delve into the global migration trends a bit more deeply. There are several major categories for understanding the increase in international migrants. First, economics and labor. So the economics of global migration impact not only countries where migrants contribute to the labor force, but also countries of origin where migrant workers often send what's called remittances. Those are financial assistance packages back to often families or loved ones. Remittances have increased from around a few $1 billion a year in 1970 to over $700 billion US dollars equivalent today. So we now have remittances from international migrants representing a very crucial form of overseas development assistance. And a lot of that is going to the countries of origin for those migrants that are developing countries like India, Mexico, Syria. Half of the world's international migrants, by the way, are concentrated in just a few developed, wealthier countries. The US is leading for world migrants. Also, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Russia, the UK are some other examples. And in these countries, those migrants represent a very important component of the labor force. Second, we see cultural and educational exchange as another important dimension. As more international migrants have traveled across countries, there's more knowledge, cultural practices, and ideas that are being shared and exchanged in this process. This is part of how the world has become more globalized, in a sense, how social movements and beliefs about democracy, business, technology innovations have become more widely dispersed. A third major category for understanding these increases in migration globally include forced displacement. A growing number of people have been forcibly displaced from their home due to violence, conflict, persecution, or environmental change. Some scholars have used the term survival migrants to capture this group of migrants in the sense that they have less of an element of choice in making their journeys because they are migrating for their own survival or the survival of their loved ones. The number of refugees, for example, has doubled since the year 2000. And this image on the right is by a Mexican artist, Ana Espriella, featured as part of the UNHCR, which is the UN Refugee Agency's Refugee Arte project. You can see the title of that art is El Corazón en la Mochila, which means the heart in the backpack, a powerful representation of how it feels the moment when a person is forced to leave their country, and the only thing they can carry is the love for their home in their own heart. And that's quoting from the artist who created this. And we can go to the next slide now. So we can get a sense of how these categories of international migrants are distributed by looking at this graphic from the International Organization for Migration, the IOM. By the way, the IOM is an intergovernmental organization which is part of the UN system and collects data on migration for its member countries. So here it has summarized for us the international migrants in terms of the proportions of these different categories. So out of around 260 million international migrants as of 2020, roughly 6 million were international students who crossed borders for educational purposes. That's getting back to that educational exchange idea. Roughly 26 million were registered with the UN Refugee Agency as people who fled persecution, harm, or torture in their countries of origin. And over half of international migrants were categorized as migrant workers. So they were traveling to or residing in countries other than the ones in which they were born for the purposes of work. Migrant workers in many countries make up an important segment of the labor force and often fill employment gaps in certain skills-based areas. In the top left of the slide, you can see, for example, some data collected by the OECD, another intergovernmental organization. It's the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. And what the table is showing us is that migrants contribute a substantial portion of doctors in developed countries like the United States, countries which are also called global north countries sometimes. So across a majority of OECD countries, these high-income countries with high human development, people who were foreign-born or foreign-trained accounted for nearly a quarter of all doctors, and over 30% of doctors in the US. By the way, in some countries like Australia, it's even higher. In Australia, over half of all doctors were foreign-born in the study, and in Canada, it was almost 40%. So the pandemic need for these kinds of frontline workers that we've become very familiar with and specialized skills has highlighted how crucial international migrants are in that area. And we can go to the next slide. When we look more closely at the category of refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced persons, or IDPs, we see that at the end of 2020, over 80 million people worldwide were forcibly displaced. So this includes over 20 million refugees that are under the mandate of the UN Refugee Agency. And we can see that data on the top right. It also includes over 5 million Palestinians that are under the UNRWA, as it's called, mandate, the UNRWA. Over 3 million Venezuelans that are displaced abroad, a very high number in recent years. 48 million people that are internally displaced, which is basically they have been forced from their homes, but they're still in the borders of their home country. And 4 million people that are seeking asylum, but they haven't yet been designated as refugees. So it's a lot of numbers and it's a lot of statistics, as comes naturally with any demographics presentation. But I'd like to remind people, these statistics represent individuals in different situations. So those are real people with unique stories. What they do share in common is that they're searching for a safe place to pursue their lives, and that's why they are in this forcibly displaced category. A couple of things we see here is a very uneven distribution of refugees. So most refugees, as captured by this graph on the bottom right of your slide, most refugees are hosted in developing countries. So around 86% of the world's refugees are in the global south countries. Some examples include Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda. And these countries are doing the most to actually shelter and host refugees. In terms of developed global north countries, Germany also contributes a lot, given its relatively smaller population size. Refugee origins are concentrated among just a few countries right now. So over half of these refugees are coming from Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, or Myanmar. We also see very inequitable effects then, because these demographic patterns illuminate the unequal effects of forced displacement. The countries that are doing the most to take in refugees and bear that responsibility have that responsibility added on top of other vulnerabilities they're already facing in terms of things like development, scarce resources, poverty, and environmental concerns. So we can go to the next slide. The effects of the pandemic have extended heavily onto forcibly displaced people that are migrating for their survival. So these effects include things like border closures and the continuation or intensification of some of the pre-pandemic expulsions and deportations that were already in place, basically sending people back to countries where they face harm or persecution. An example here in the US includes the expulsion of thousands of Haitian migrants and asylum seekers who crossed the US southern border in Del Rio, Texas. You may remember images like this from September of 2021 that show US Border Patrol agents on horseback using long reins, which appeared to the people looking on as whips as they were chasing people who had crossed the southern border. And a lot of them were carrying bags of food. You can sort of see the takeout containers visible in their bags. So these images and similar ones from those Haitian asylum seekers and migrants prompted a lot of criticism, not only for the Border Patrol tactics as degrading or inhumane, but more deeply, it was about the core of the policy. Well, why were these people being corralled and ultimately expelled? And it was a public health ordinance referred to as Title 42, a health code from the 1940s that two successive US administrations, both Trump and Biden, have used in the context of the pandemic to justify mass expulsions of migrants. So over 8,500 Haitians were expelled in the fall of 2021, and they were often expelled under this Title 42 policy without asylum screenings. Now, that violates principles of international law and even aspects of US law. But the Biden administration emphasized it was continued on from the Trump administration in the name of the pandemic. So that's something that we can see as a US example, but there are a lot in other countries as well. We can go to the next slide. And here you're seeing this containment and deterrence approach, because I wanted to also give you a broader global perspective of that. Title 42 is just something that's US specific related to the pandemic and expelling migrants. But worldwide, there are similar measures that have been used in the name of the pandemic to intensify containment and deterrence. Of course, containment has a lot of different meanings depending on the context you hear that word. In this context, I want to be clear, migration containment is referring to trying to contain migrants in an area, deter them or prevent them from seeking or making asylum claims by preventing them from ever reaching the territories of wealthier global north countries where they could then make those claims. So the way containment and deterrence works is often those wealthier countries will work with partners to target land and sea crossings, again, to prevent those migrants from ever reaching their shores or ever directly reaching their land borders. Many European Union countries not only suspended the asylum processing during the pandemic, but have also suspended search and rescue operations at sea as part of emergency legislation in response to the pandemic. Of course, well before the pandemic, the European Union partnered with the Libyan Coast Guard to intercept migrants and asylum seekers and to block them from arriving at European ports. So those deterrence measures just intensified during the pandemic. As shown with this image, in July of 2021, members of a German NGO called the Sea Watch International filmed an incident while flying over the Mediterranean. They were on an observation mission, and the Libyan Coast Guard was basically shooting at a small migrant boat, multiple times trying to purposefully capsize it, also ramming against it. The Coast Guard was throwing objects at some of the people inside it, and these kinds of tactics are not often captured on film, but when they are, it's a reminder that this containment and deterrence approach is used often when people are not really paying attention, except, of course, for the people in those boats that are really living through that experience. So we can go to the next slide now. That example that we were just looking at with the Libyan Coast Guard partnering with the European Union highlights the dangerous nature of these journeys for forcibly displaced people and the extent to which, despite all these advancements we've had in human development worldwide, those journeys have actually become more perilous, meaning they're more dangerous and more life-threatening in recent years than they were even several decades ago. In the first half of 2021, nearly 15,000 people, including children, were intercepted and returned to Libyan shores, and over 700 people died or went missing on the Mediterranean sea route. These graphics are from the Missing Migrants Project, and they're showing us even the bigger picture since 2014, where over 20,000 migrants and asylum seekers died just trying to cross into Europe. And worldwide, over 40,000 people have died or gone missing in their migration journeys. And we can go to the next slide. The pandemic has contributed to these harsh situations and desperation that are driving people to flee, even at the risk of their own lives. So in Latin America and the Caribbean, the pandemic has pushed almost 5 million people out of the middle class and into poverty. And the bar graph on the bottom right is reflecting the number of people facing food scarcity and hunger. And this is something that is showing us specifically the percentage of children under 5 who have their growth stunted due to malnutrition. And that climbed to over 40% in Guatemala, over 20% in Honduras. In Guatemala, food insecurity doubled due to COVID-19. Chronic malnutrition results not only in stunted growth, but also cognitive problems and weakened immune systems. And that food insecurity is layered with other vulnerabilities in those regions, like political violence and environmental change. If you've heard of the corridor seco, the dry corridor, which stretches through those countries like Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, that area had already experienced droughts and extreme weather conditions that disrupted the cropping seasons. And now we have almost 8 million people in that region in need of food aid. So, what we're getting from this is that the pandemic essentially added on another layer onto the environmental vulnerability for those populations. And those interact with population pressures. So, a lot of the things we're thinking about with demographic change are heavily intertwined. European countries are expected to experience aging, the population decline concept we were talking about. But these sorts of regions, like the Central American region and Latin America and the Caribbean more broadly, are actually experiencing a lot of population growth. And with the food insecurity and environmental change, there are then population pressures. So we're seeing that's something like political violence, food insecurity, environmental change. They actually become compounded by the demographic pressures of the population growth in these areas. And we can move to the next slide. So this brings us to questions about the more wide-ranging consequences of population growth. There are concerns about the economic consequences of those aging populations. The slower growth actually can give more time to countries, however, to build foundations for sustainability. So if we think about the broader picture of unprecedented global population growth, again, this is something which the growth rate tripled since the mid-20th century. So we added over 5 billion more people to the planet in the 20th century. It's important to consider how those extraordinary demographic growth changes can also challenge humanity in the realm of environmental harm. And by the way, for environmental harm, just to help you with thinking of some examples associated with population growth, we're thinking about climate change, biodiversity loss, deforestation, drought, ecological degradation, also things like natural resource depletion and pollution. So when we look through the lens of environmental effects, rather than just purely those economic effects of aging, we can think of a broader planetary perspective. And slower population growth from that perspective might actually be reducing some stresses on the Earth's environment if we would continue to go towards a population decline rather than going towards a population growth. This image that you're looking at is the Republic of Kiribati. It's an island country that is in the Central Pacific near the equator. And this image is Tarawa Atoll. It's sort of halfway between Hawaii and Australia. So Kiribati is one of the lowest lying countries in the world. Some islands are just 2 meters above sea level, for example, and they are extremely vulnerable to sea level rise. A couple of the islets disappeared underwater completely back in 1999. So these sorts of small island countries faced really devastating consequences like flooding and erosion and soil contamination, really just even shrinking land area that can then feed into migration and forced displacement among the inhabitants. And we can move to the next slide. When we consider the environmental harm caused by population growth, we tend to talk about what's called negative externalities. Negative externalities just means unintended consequences or indirect costs of human population growth. These are associated with increased traditional economic activities as well. So pollution and loss of biodiversity are a couple examples. The top right image that you see here is industrial waste coming from a dye factory in China several years ago. And that image really captured growing attention to the environmental degradation caused by economic development. And China and India are a couple of those countries expected to be the most populous countries in the world if fertility rates remain constant by the end of the century. That means those countries will be especially challenged to rein in environmental destruction and all of those related health consequences that come along with that. For example, in China, a lot of the drinking water has been contaminated by human and industrial waste, and groundwater and surface water have been designated unsafe. So digestive cancer rates have been quite high in certain areas as an associated factor with that. If you look at this lower image here, you're seeing deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. And these kinds of examples reflect a broader need for more sustainable economic growth and planning, including things like food system planning. And I mention food systems here because agriculture is the leading driver of deforestation, not only in the Brazilian Amazon, but worldwide. And the more trees which are cut, the less the forest can soak up carbon emissions. And so that's why it is also directly related to other environmental issues. Deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon, by the way, in 2021 hit the highest annual level in a decade. Roughly the size of Manhattan in New York City was cleared in January of 2022 alone. A lot of this is demand for beef and soybeans, most of which are used to feed the livestock. And that fuels a lot of illegal clearings as well. And we can move to the next slide. The height of these pandemic lockdowns that we experienced in 2020 actually offered us a unique moment for understanding this relationship between human activity and human population and environmental harm. So globally, air pollution dropped during the height of those lockdowns. In April 2020, there were clear skies over Los Angeles, as shown by this image, due to travel and business restrictions that were designed to slow the virus. In China, also, people could not leave their homes for several weeks, and studies found a direct correlation with major drops in air pollution emissions. So air pollution and passenger car traffic showed the greatest declines during those lockdowns. And on to the next slide, we can see this example of New Delhi. These images are showing us New Delhi's India Gate, which was obscured, if you look at the top image, back in October of 2019 by pollution haze. But then during the height of the COVID lockdowns in April of 2020, the bottom image, the view was strikingly clear. This was a case of pollution from vehicle traffic dramatically dropping. And New Delhi is actually the world's most polluted capital. Some studies have found nearly 80% of families in Delhi and the surrounding areas suffer from headaches or breathing trouble due to those pollution effects. There are also studies that find more than 1 million lives are lost each year in India due to toxic air. So these are just some examples. You can find a lot more in a lot of different countries. And on to the next slide. This brings us to the sustainability planning aspect. Those people looking at the effects of the pandemic lockdowns reignited calls for moving towards lower emissions or more sustainable paths to recovering after the pandemic, recovering our economic growth, basically building back in a greener way. But the priority has really been a return to normalcy as much as possible. So we can see here that after falling slightly in 2020, global carbon dioxide returned to pre-pandemic levels. It's this image on the left, it's showing you the quote bounce back of fossil fuel emissions. So you can see that very slight decline there. It was just around 5% during the first year of the pandemic, and then the upward trajectory of CO2, of carbon emissions, that returned. And the top green line is showing you the total carbon emissions globally, while the different colored lines below are showing you the top emitters like China, the US, and India. China actually returned to historic levels of coal burning in 2021 to try and put their coal plants into overdrive as part of the post-pandemic economic recovery. Attention to these greenhouse gases really keeps the focus on climate change, where a lot of economists and scientists looking at sustainability call for more focus on biodiversity losses. So this image on the right is getting at different trajectories or possibilities of biodiversity loss, depending on how we plan for the future. in the business as usual scenario, we would end up with a planet that maybe could not support future generations of life due to biodiversity loss. And in more sustainable trajectories, it would require us to moderate our food systems, reduce food waste, or move towards diets with lower environmental impacts, also developing sustainable trade. All of this is really challenged by doing that in a way that doesn't drive up food prices or undermine efforts to reduce global hunger. So these scientists that work on conservation and trajectories of biodiversity loss emphasize it's really important to work also with political scientists and those that are in the public policy field, because to actually implement sustainability to support human population growth, there will need to be public policy changes. And on to the next slide. So as we're kind of closing up, it's very controversial to specify any optimal human population on Earth. But there's this recent book which is quite intriguing, Time and Generations: Population Ethics for a Diminishing Planet. This is by a Cambridge University economist, Sir Partha Dasgupta. He argues that the optimal human population might range somewhere between 500 million and 5 billion. Remember from that first slide that we're at around 7 billion, or actually climbing towards 8 billion, in which case, if Dasgupta's projections are correct, we would actually need to see a decline in population growth. And Dasgupta argues the economic growth we've seen in recent decades might actually harm us in the long run because we are spending down natural capital and threatening essential ecosystems. So thinkers like Dasgupta press us to consider a couple of questions. First, how is our economic and population growth degrading our biosphere? And by biosphere, this is referring to the existence of life across all ecosystems, oceans, rainforests, etc. It's really prompting us to think about how many people can be sustained globally when we take into account the planet's long-term carrying capacity. So how will our descendants have to pay for the environmental externalities of this current growth? How will their access to food, shelter, physical security be jeopardized by living on a less habitable planet? Dasgupta argues that it's not enough to just focus on things like climate change and technological innovation, but he's really pushing people to think about reducing consumption or limiting population growth rates. It may even be something like 3 million people, he argues, if we really wanted people to have a quality of life where they could have even, say, an average world income of something like $20,000. So we would need far less people in that case. It's also pressing us to ask, how can our economic models include things like biodiversity costs? And in the sense that biosphere is really being treated as a human resource for human use. Of course, there are others who would approach this topic by taking into account interspecies perspectives, but economists like Dasgupta are really just focused on those ecosystems as a finite resource for human quality of life. And on to the next slide. So in conclusion, these arguments are really provocative and controversial for some in thinking about how we have these ethical questions around human population growth. But there is a sense that continuing population growth with excessive consumption will play a substantial global role in degrading the planet and undermining our ability to have an ecologically sustainable future. So there are a few unknowns I just wanted to end with to leave you with some thoughts. First is the long-term effects of the pandemic. So one unknown emerges around sort of beyond the immediate, what are the multi-wave, the intergenerational effects of the pandemic? Because those will have impacts on poverty, malnutrition, mental health, as we know. So it's been a big factor related to the pandemic. And all of those sort of layered vulnerabilities that I was speaking about before. And we don't fully understand those effects yet. We know that the pandemic resulted in a greater decline in life expectancy for some people, but it's unclear if that impact will fade over time. There's also a lot of unknowns around the consequences of things like long COVID, so we're still learning and getting information. Next is the population growth factor. The unknown here is that the growth predictions themselves carry a lot of uncertainties. Variation in fertility rates in the decades ahead could lead to widely varying projections. So it could be as low as 7 billion people inhabiting by the end of the century, a half a billion less than today, or it could be as high as 16 billion people by the end of the century. So those are really different trajectories. The role of population in economic growth is another big area of debate. Some suggest that having lower population in high income countries and high population in low income countries is really destabilizing and undermines development. And this brings us to the third unknown, which is how governments and publics will respond to growing international migration. Because international migration might actually help adjust demographic imbalances and offset some of those negative effects of things like aging. Public opinion in high income countries, however, tends to be really opposed to migration. And there's also a really complicated relationship between some types of migration and economic growth. So even if demographic projections and economic experts offered formulas for how migration could stabilize aging populations, public opinion might still be resistant to migration for other reasons, which we see very much worldwide today. And then finally, how do we calculate the ecological loss aspect of the picture? We don't really have an agreed upon way to calculate biodiversity losses. Some people focus on the Earth's surface being able to meet demands of natural resources, just sort of a biocapacity to determine how sustainable or unsustainable resource consumption is. There are also efforts to calculate the so-called ecological footprints, if you've ever heard that term, of different countries by looking at the regenerative capacity of their resources. So that's sort of asking us how long would it take for the Earth to create that resource again or to rebuild it again, such as wood consumption and rainforest collapse. In general, wealthy countries like the United States have a higher ecological footprint because the lifestyle of people in these populations entails a very high use of resources among fewer people relative to other countries. Also, those calculations, though, are often just focused on human consumption. They might not be taking into account other species, which humans also depend on. So in conclusion, there are a lot of unknowns, both in terms of the demographic trends themselves, things that we've looked at, such as how much larger the world population will become, how pandemics will intervene in mortality and life expectancy, or how migration might offset aging populations in developed countries. And there are unknowns in proposing paths forward towards a more sustainable future. Because changes to the way we live will require public policy changes, even if the answer to these questions becomes clear, we would still need to find ways to build consensus among the humans that currently inhabit the planet, which, speaking as a political scientist, I can say is not an easy task. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coen, for that incredible lecture. If anyone has any questions, please type them into the comments section, and we will get to them now. That it's a lot to chew on. I mean, I don't want to sound incredibly like vague or anything, but the answers the solution seems so uncertain. And it's a bit overwhelming. And I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but if anyone has any questions, please type them into the comment section, and we will get them to Dr. Coen. What if you were put in charge?
Oh no.
I know. Well,
Worst case scenario.
Well, I didn't say that. But what do you believe would be the best path forward with everything we're facing? I mean, and there's a lot of crystal balling it because there are so many unknowns which affect the realities. So, what would you, in your opinion? I mean, I'm just asking purely opinion.
Sure.
What's the best course forward?
There are some positive examples. So a lot of countries in Northern Europe, like Denmark and Sweden, have really developed their policy planning around sustainability now, and they've moved towards things like renewable resources for fuel and consumption. Um, I think it's Switzerland has almost eliminated all landfills now. So there are these examples. Costa Rica is another one in Latin America that has really developed a lot of sustainability planning and it's going very well. So I think that would be the starting point, would be to sort of look at positive examples of countries that have, of course, the caveat, all these countries I'm naming, they're very small. They're usually very small populations, right? Germany and France are larger and they have done a lot in sustainability. But yes, these smaller population countries have been most successful so far in implementing that. But we could start there. We could sort of look and see, what is something that could be implementable that has worked well in those countries that are kind of leading in sustainability, and go from there and try and practice and experiment, with those tactics.
I had a question that just came in. Mark was wondering, what are the population trends in the US and what effect is this having on employment issues?
Yeah, so that's a very complicated one. It's a good question from Mark. The population trends in the US were, kind of offsetting the decline in fertility that a lot of European countries and countries like Japan have experienced very high with migration. So we were not seeing that aging population problem in the same way some of those other countries have, because we have such a high level of immigration. But with the pandemic, there's a lot of questions around, for example, the life expectancy has fallen, and because it's still so early, so that's why it's hard and there's so many unknowns. But there are studies that show there is a decline in the desire to have children related to the pandemic. So even separate from other factors, because there are already factors like the high costs of having children and raising them, the lack of support for working parents, the kind of infrastructure that would be needed to support higher fertility. Those things were there before the pandemic, but then with the pandemic, there's been a lot of mental health, a lot of anxiety, a lot of insecurity about the future. And so the studies that I have seen so far are really suggesting there's a decline in the desire to have children. And so that's what we'll have to look and see. If we will continue to have immigration rates that will offset that, then that will be, a determinant of whether it creates an issue for our infrastructure overall. We also know there are shortages, which Mark mentions in the question, where a lot of employers have struggled to find people to fill those niches or to meet that skill. And that's also because it's very complicated. It's related to the pandemic, and it's related to having more, part-time work and types of work that are not suitable for everybody's lifestyle or life choices. So yeah, it's a really big question, but I can say that we are different from some of those other aging populations because we've had such high immigration that has helped offset the aging population.
And I mean, obviously, the pandemic is probably the largest mitigating factor in practically everything at the moment, correct? I mean, or is that just an assumption
Well, I
that
think
because it's so omnipresent, like with its coverage?
Yeah, I think it's really the biggest question mark. That's how I would say it's the biggest question mark over a lot of these things is studies trying to determine, well, we had these declines in life expectancy related to the pandemic, but are they big enough and deep enough that they will actually impact overall, growth rates of population for the future? And that's not clear. After the 1918 pandemic, there was a big bounce in childbirths, in the years after that. But we don't really have the conditions to match that. We actually see the opposite effect, as I was mentioning, where people would feel less desire to bring more children in. So it's just still very unclear whether the decline in life expectancy from COVID-19 will actually make any difference in the overall rates. And that's something we have to get more information to know.
Um, I again encourage everyone following along, and I can see that there are a number of you out there following along. Please ask some questions. We have an incredible resource at our disposal this evening, so we shouldn't squander it. But yeah, to go back to what you were saying about the smaller countries, setting examples and creating models, uh, what will it take, do you think, like for larger population centers and the larger countries to actually take that seriously and follow suit? Is it just simply going to be necessity, or what do you think will, force the hand of actually paying attention and not being dismissive?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it might start at the more local area because some cities might take a lead. And we've already seen that some cities, make their own local ordinances, have more bike lanes, for example. So they want to encourage people to drive less and to use, less polluting ways of travel. So there are things like that that cities do in their local ordinances or in their, planning. And so I think we could see the local level would be one prong for how this moves forward in a country like the United States that's so big. And also local autonomy is very important to us. We want to feel like it's not being forced on us from the federal government. That's often something people really feel strongly about. And so there are some federal level initiatives, and that really changes from president to president, how hard they'll pursue that. And it's very hard to get things like that passed through Congress. So really, I would say if I was looking very brutally, honestly at this, I would think a lot of change will need to happen at the local level for people to really believe in it and feel like it's their own organic idea, and they really feel motivated to, have more sustainable ways of living. I think it will start more locally.
So that grassroots movements will drive it more
Yes,
in,
and
in a perfect world.
Yeah, grassroots movement. Because I think that the thing is, and we can see this with so many political issues, so I'm bringing in my political science lens here. We can see people really don't like to feel that the federal government has imposed things on them and that they're being forced to make changes to their lifestyle. So if there is something, if there's sort of buy-in where locally people are thinking about themselves as inhabiting planet Earth, and so what can I do where I am living now that will actually help future descendants or future generations to have a more habitable planet, if they feel that this is something their own community is really developing, I think that will be the key. If it's coming like these new federal mandates where we have to move towards certain kinds of energy, that's where you tend to see people much more resistant. So that's just my own personal take, is that local change would be something that people internalize more, so then they support it more, and public opinion would probably be more on board.
Where people would actually feel as if they had a stake in it, as opposed to being directed towards what they should do.
Absolutely. And
Okay.
this is where education comes in too, because if people aren't aware of even thinking about these issues, then obviously human beings would just think, well, what about my own interests tomorrow and next week and next year? Why are you asking me to think about 2100, the year 2100, and the growth of global population? So there is something you can understand, like a selfish aspect where what is your incentive to really think about descendants of planet Earth in the future? And I think that's something that would come from communities and from families or networks that we feel passionate about it because we really believe it's something that's right to do. If we don't feel it's important, then we would have basically no incentive to care about the people living here 100 years or thousands of years from now.
So you're saying that education and doing the right thing are important.
Education and probably local policy
Yeah.
initiatives, awareness, even having people think about what is sustainability and what is our global population. I don't think people are even aware necessarily of what's happened, that we've had this unprecedented boom in population in the last 100 years, and it's not really sustainable in terms of the Earth's resources. I don't necessarily know. I don't want to speak for others, but it's not something you hear on a day-to-day basis necessarily. Now, in other countries where it's really centralized, it is something that's more mainstream that people are more aware of. But in the U.S., I think we could probably talk about it a lot more than we do.
Mark has another really good multi question input for you. At what point is the world overpopulated? Or is there such a thing? Or does it have more to do with regions and the relative wealth of the regions?
Yeah, another great question with all of its parts. So it's hard to pinpoint an exact time. I mean, if you would look at someone like Dasgupta and his argument, where he says what's really sustainable at the max might be 5 billion people, then we would say, oh, we're at 7.8 billion, or something like that. So we're pushing past that. We need to get those population growth rates perhaps down if we want to have sustainable way of living for the future. But absolutely, it depends on region, because some of those areas are so pressured by population growth, and then other places have these aging populations. But if we just look worldwide, we can see that we're already maybe exceeding what the Earth can support. We would need maybe 1.6 is the number I often see, 1.6 planets. If we keep at our current population and consumption, we would need almost like a whole extra planet Earth to give us the resources that we're using right now. So yeah, if you look at it that way, we've already moved past the ideal level for sustainability. So we should perhaps try and reduce it. But no, that's very controversial, right? People are like, well, how would you do that? And what would that entail? And which regions will you focus on? And what public policies? Because we know in places like China, for example, they had a one-child policy for a long time. It was incredibly controversial. And now they've completely lifted it. It's gone, and they have the problem now of people not wanting to have children, in part because it's so expensive, and there's very little in terms of affordable housing in the big cities.
Wow. Yeah. Anne has a question as a follow up. I'm not sure exactly to which point, since we've covered a lot of ground, but we have Russia and China collaborating. How will this impact the environment and population?
Yeah, that's a really great thing to think about, is the role of these rising powers. Often we think about the United States as a superpower, but when we really look, this is a multipolar world where these other countries are growing in influence, and they are sometimes working together as allies to spread that influence into different places. And Russia and China, we know, are doing that, and they are partnering to help sort of balance out a U.S. power. So Russia and China are also two countries that are expected to have some of the largest world populations by the end of the century. Now, for China, they have really taken seriously some of the environmental issues. For example, I was reading about cracking down on executives in China, executives that were faking pollution reports. So China is taking much more seriously the fact that if they want to have a quality of life and human development level that is sustainable, even just for the next few decades, they will need to rein in some of the environmental destruction effects of the economic growth that they've had, the economic, progress and industrialization they've had. So there are examples even of China jailing executives recently that were falsifying some of the reports over their emissions or pollution. So that's one aspect for China in terms of it taking that more seriously, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they would take that seriously in their foreign policies with other countries, because if they are sort of racing to work together to balance against the United States, it's likely they would put, strategic military factors before environmental sustainability factors.
I just wanted to remind people to continue to ask questions, but also next week, our topic is the Quad Alliance, and our presenter will be Marty Farrell from Ripon College. I think it's interesting the way that the Foreign Policy Association puts their topics together, that things really do feed off of each other, and even if it's not like right next to each other, things that you were bringing up earlier, for example, just the topic of Myanmar is going to be, one of our things. I love that the interconnectivity of the lectures that they suggest really feeds into understanding the interconnectivity of how nothing is isolated anymore.
Absolutely.
So We still have a little bit of time left. If anyone has any more questions, please feel free to ask them. Um, Otherwise, if people don't have questions, do you have any wise, insightful words of conclusion, Dr. Cohen? I'll
I
put you
think,
on the spot again. Apparently, I don't mind
oh,
doing that repeatedly.
that's no problem at all. I think that one thing I'd like to reiterate, I sort of touched on earlier, was how interlinked these demographic factors are. And I think one of the big themes that emerged from the presentation is the inequities. When we were even thinking about the effects of the pandemic, how much harder certain countries and then certain segments of society have been hit than others. And so all of those demographic trends, they end up putting the most pressure often on the people that are the most vulnerable to start with. And so that's one thing I hope people would take away. And another thing I hope people would take away is that we need lots of different people with lots of different areas of expertise in lots of different fields working together, because these demographic challenges and changes are so complicated. We need, conservationists working with scientists and economists and political scientists, working on public policy and public opinion. We need all of this. So even, if there are people that are at a stage in life where they're thinking about career trajectories and that sort of thing, or where they already are and how they could use their knowledge, these demographic issues that were presented tonight touches almost every field. So that's something where we could really see, I think, exciting collaboration of how we can solve some of these issues, or maybe not solve them. Maybe solving is a bit steep, but start to think about what's actually doable in a country like the United States. Is we could bring these different fields together more, because often they don't talk to each other enough, I think, for these topics.
Agreed. I think that is an excellent way to end this presentation. A fantastic summation, fantastic lecture. Thank you so much, Dr. Cohen, for being here again this year. And good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this great lecture on a great topic. I guess that's why they call it Great Decisions. And thank you so much for being here. Please join us next week for Professor Martin Farrell and the Quad Alliance. And thank you for joining us tonight. And until next week, have a great week, everyone. Thank you,
Thanks.
Dr. Cohen.
Thanks so much, Tim.